How did my parents' home turn out to be a crime scene? The woman at the gas station counter stared at me for too long before handing back my credit card. Her hand was shaking. I chalked it up to small-town weirdness and grabbed my coffee, eager to reach the lake house before the sun set completely. The drive from Chicago had taken 4 hours, and my parents weren't expecting me until tomorrow, but I'd wanted to surprise them with an early arrival. October in rural Wisconsin meant the roads got dark fast, and I'd already missed 2 turns because my phone's GPS kept losing signal in these dense forests. The lake house appeared exactly as my parents had described it over the years. Modest 2-story structure with blue shutters, wraparound porch, isolated enough to feel like a true retreat. I'd never visited before despite my parents making this annual pilgrimage every October 14th for as long as I could remember. They'd always called it their anniversary trip, their time to reconnect away from city stress. This year, I'd finally convinced them to let me join, though I'd decided to arrive a day early to help set things up and maybe snoop through their vacation spot without them hovering over me. The key was under the 3rd flower pot, exactly where my mother said it would be. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through empty rooms. Inside, the air smelled wrong. Not musty like a vacation home that sat empty most of the year, but chemical. Bleach mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The furniture was sparse and cheap, nothing like the cozy family photos my parents had shown me. No personal touches, no vacation memories decorating the walls, just empty spaces that felt staged, like a movie set pretending to be a home. I set my overnight bag by the stairs and pulled out my phone to text my mother that I'd arrived safely. No signal. I walked through the first floor trying different spots, holding my phone toward windows like some kind of ritual that might summon service. Nothing. A landline hung on the kitchen wall, ancient rotary dial covered in dust. I picked up the receiver and got a dial tone but decided against calling. The surprise would be better in person tomorrow morning when they arrived and found me already settled in with breakfast prepared. Walking to town seemed like a better option than sitting alone in the strange-smelling house. My mother had mentioned the main street was only half a mile away, and I needed to stretch my legs after the long drive. The trail through the woods was unmarked, and I got turned around twice before emerging onto a cracked sidewalk that led to Millbrook's downtown. 8 buildings total, half of them with windows so dirty I couldn't tell if they were abandoned or just neglected. A diner called Ruthie's had a flickering neon sign that drew me like a beacon. The moment I pushed through the door, every conversation stopped. A dozen faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked like fear. The silence was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. A man behind the register dropped the coffee pot he'd been holding, and it shattered across the floor in an explosion of glass and brown liquid. Nobody moved to clean it up. They just kept staring at me like I'd walked in covered in blood instead of wearing jeans and a Northwestern hoodie. I forced myself to walk to a booth near the window, each step feeling like I was wading through invisible resistance. A waitress approached slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. She was maybe 60 with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her hands shook when she handed me the laminated menu, and I noticed her name tag said Dorothy. I ordered coffee and asked if she knew anything about the lake house with the blue shutters. The menu fell from her fingers and clattered onto the table. She backed away without picking it up, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Through the serving window, I could see her talking urgently to the man from the register, both of them gesturing and glancing back at me every few seconds. The other customers had resumed talking, but in hushed tones, creating a buzz of whispered conversation that made my skin prickle with unease. Something was very wrong here, and I was at the center of it without understanding why. The man from the register approached my booth with careful, measured steps. His hands were shaking worse than Dorothy's had been. He introduced himself as Owen and asked if I was staying at the Henley house. I told him I didn't know any Henleys, but confirmed I was at the lake house with blue shutters. His face went through a series of emotions too fast to track. Shock, disbelief, hope, terror. He asked my name, and when I said Lily Whitmore, he made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and showed me a photograph. A little girl, maybe 3 years old, with dark curly hair and a gap-toothed smile. She had my eyes, my nose, the exact dimple in her left cheek that I'd always been self-conscious about. The resemblance wasn't just similar, it was identical. I was looking at a photo of myself as a toddler, except I'd never seen this picture before in my life. Owen's voice cracked when he asked where I was really from and how long I'd been with the Whitmores. The question made no sense. I'd been Lily Whitmore my entire life. Born in Chicago 24 years ago, raised by David and Susan Whitmore, graduated from Northwestern last year. Owen sat down across from me without asking permission and showed me more photos. A woman who could have been my mother. A man with my exact eyebrow shape. Their wedding photo from 1997. Their obituary. The obituary listed them as survived by their son Owen, age 10, and daughter Lily, age 3, whereabouts unknown. The date was October 15th, 2000. I told Owen he was wrong, that this was some kind of mistake or sick joke, but he kept showing me more evidence on his phone. Articles about a home invasion at a lake house, a family murdered in their beds, a little girl vanished without a trace, police photos of the crime scene that showed the same blue shutters, the same wraparound porch, the same house where I'd just spent the last hour, where my parents were planning to arrive tomorrow morning. My vision started narrowing to a tunnel, and Owen caught my arm as I swayed in the booth. Dorothy brought water without being asked, and the other customers had stopped pretending not to watch. Owen explained in a rush of words that his parents had bought the lake house as a vacation retreat in 1997. Every October, they'd driven up from Milwaukee for a long weekend to see the fall colors. On October 14th, 2000, someone had broken in while they slept. His parents were killed and his 3-year-old sister disappeared. The investigation went cold. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no leads. Owen had been sleeping at a friend's house that night, the only reason he'd survived. I pulled out my driver's license and birth certificate to prove he was wrong, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking enough to hold them steady. Owen looked at the documents and then back at the photo of his sister. The birth date matched, March 3rd, 1997. She would be 27 now, exactly my age. He asked if I had any memories from before age 5, and the question cut through me like a knife, because I'd always thought it was strange that my earliest clear memory was from kindergarten. Nothing before that except vague impressions and dreams that felt more like borrowed memories from someone else's life. The diner door banged open and an elderly man walked in, spotted me, and froze so completely he might have been having a stroke. He shouted for Sheriff Amos, and Owen pulled out his phone to make the call. Within minutes, a middle-aged black woman in uniform arrived, her hand resting on her radio. Sheriff Amos approached the booth and asked Owen what was going on. He showed her the photos and my documents. She studied both for a long time before sitting down and asking me a question that made the floor feel like it was falling away beneath me. Had my parents ever explained why I didn't have any photos or memories from before age 5? The question unlocked something I'd spent years not thinking about. My mother had always said their house flooded when I was 4, destroying all the baby photos and early memorabilia. They'd moved to Chicago right after for a fresh start, but I'd covered a flood story for my college newspaper and seen what real water damage looked like. The loss my mother described had been too complete, too convenient. Every baby photo gone, every childhood memento destroyed. No relatives to provide backups because my parents claimed they were both only children whose parents had died young. We'd existed in this bubble of isolation my entire life, and I'd never questioned it until this moment. Sheriff Amos asked if I would consent to a DNA test and fingerprinting. My mouth was too dry to answer, so I just nodded. She made calls while Owen sat across from me crying openly, hope and terror fighting for dominance in his expression. Other customers were making their own calls now, word spreading through the small town that something impossible was happening at Ruthie's diner. Within 20 minutes, the parking lot was filling with cars and people pressing against the windows to catch a glimpse of the girl who might be Lily Henley, the missing daughter, the cold case that had haunted this town for 24 years. Sheriff Amos drove me to the police station in her cruiser, while Owen followed in his truck. She explained they still had DNA from the original crime scene, blood on little Lily Henley's pillowcase from a nosebleed she'd had a few days before she disappeared. The lab could rush the results given the circumstances. She asked where my parents were, and I explained they were supposed to arrive at the lake house tomorrow morning. Her expression hardened in a way that made my stomach drop. She picked up her radio and started coordinating with state police while I sat in the back seat feeling like I was drowning in information I couldn't process. At the station, a female deputy took me through fingerprinting with gentle efficiency. Press here. Roll to the side. Other hand now. The ink was cold and the process felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. Sheriff Amos explained she'd contacted Chicago PD to do a wellness check on my parents' apartment. She'd put out an alert for their vehicle. She'd tried calling them multiple times with no answer. Their phones went straight to voicemail. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair while she made call after call, her tone becoming more urgent each time. Hours crawled by, marked by bad coffee and questions I couldn't properly answer. Owen paced the waiting area, periodically looking through the glass at me like I might vanish if he stopped watching. Sheriff Amos came back with an update that made my chest tight. Chicago PD had found my parents' apartment empty, mail piling up, no signs of recent occupation. Their credit cards hadn't been used in over a week. Their phones' last known locations pinged near Millbrook 3 days ago. They were already here, somewhere close, waiting for tomorrow's anniversary of whatever had really happened at that lake house 24 years ago. Sheriff Amos asked permission to search the house, and I gave it immediately, desperate for anything that might make sense of this nightmare. We drove back as the sun set, turning the forest into a maze of shadows. Owen followed in his truck, his headlights a comfort in my rearview mirror. The house looked different in darkness, more sinister with its empty windows and isolated location. Sheriff Amos and 2 deputies searched the first floor methodically while I stood in the kitchen with Owen, neither of us able to speak. Then one of the deputies called out from upstairs and everything changed. Sheriff Amos ordered us outside, and we stood on the porch in the cold October air for 20 minutes before she emerged. Her face was set in hard, angry lines. They'd found a locked room on the second floor that I'd assumed was just a storage closet. Inside was a shrine to the Henley family, photos covering every wall, newspaper clippings about the murders, a baby book with Lily Henley written in careful script, and most damning of all, a journal belonging to Susan Whitmore detailing her descent into obsession and the plan to take the perfect daughter she believed the universe owed her. The journal entries started years before the murders, documenting Susan's struggles with infertility and her crumbling marriage. She joined a support group for couples dealing with reproductive issues. That group had slowly transformed into something darker, people so broken by loss they were willing to break any law to fill the void. A disbarred private investigator who helped identify targets, a fired nurse who provided sedatives, a locksmith who taught them how to bypass security systems. Over months, they'd planned kidnappings disguised as home invasions, and the Henley family had been their third target. But something had gone wrong. Sheriff Amos read from the journal entries for October 14th and 15th, 2000. Susan had written about hiding in the woods behind the house, watching through windows as the family ate dinner and put little Lily to bed. David was supposed to drug everyone and take only the child. But my real father had woken during the intrusion. There'd been a struggle. David Whitmore had panicked and used a knife. Susan's entries devolved into justifications, claiming they'd only wanted to save a child, that accidents happen, that God had given them the daughter they deserved. Every word was a knife twisting in my chest, because these people had raised me, loved me, built their entire lives around me while standing on the foundation of murder. Owen made a sound like an animal in pain, and I realized I was making similar noises. Sheriff Amos called for backup, and within an hour the house was swarming with state police and forensic investigators. They found blood in the floorboards upstairs, traces that luminol revealed despite someone's attempts to clean thoroughly. They found forged documents in the locked room, fake birth certificates, fraudulent adoption papers created by someone skilled in document forgery. My entire legal identity was false. Carefully constructed lies that had held up for 24 years because no one thought to question a couple moving to a new city with their young daughter. A state police detective interviewed me for 3 hours at the station, asking about every detail of my childhood I could remember. I told him about my mother's anxiety whenever I asked about baby photos. My father's insistence we never discuss the past. The way they'd discouraged me from getting too close to other families or developing relationships that might involve sharing family history. Every quirk and oddity that I'd dismissed as parental eccentricity now revealed itself as calculated deception designed to hide their unforgivable crime. The detective explained this case would involve federal agencies because my parents had crossed state lines with a kidnapped child. The FBI would take over. He warned the next weeks would be difficult as the truth came out publicly. I'd need support systems in place. Media would be relentless. I'd have to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with the people who'd called themselves my parents. Owen was waiting when I finished, sitting in the lobby with coffee he'd gotten from a vending machine. He handed me a cup and we sat without speaking, both of us trying to process the impossible truth. Sheriff Amos approached with an update that made my heart race. Preliminary DNA results confirmed I was Lily Henley. The fingerprints matched prints lifted from toys in the locked room. I was the stolen daughter, the missing person, the cold case that had consumed this town's grief for more than 2 decades. My parents, the Whitmores, were now wanted for kidnapping, conspiracy, and double murder. Every law enforcement agency in the country had their photos and vehicle description. Sheriff Amos said they couldn't have gone far if they'd planned to arrive at the lake house tomorrow. They were probably staying somewhere nearby, completely unaware their secret had been discovered. Owen offered his guest room and I accepted because the alternative was sitting alone in a hotel losing my mind. His house was small but filled with photos of people I should have known. My real mother holding baby me. My real father teaching little Owen to ride a bike. Moments of happiness frozen before everything ended. Owen saw me staring at a photo of his mother and said I had her smile. Her way of tilting my head when I was thinking. He'd spent 24 years searching for me, checking missing children databases, following false leads, refusing to leave Millbrook because it was where he'd last seen his family whole. We stayed up until dawn while Owen told me about my real parents. My father had been an accountant who volunteered teaching financial literacy to at-risk youth. My mother had been a teacher specializing in learning disabilities. They'd been genuinely good people who believed in helping others, and that goodness had gotten them murdered by people who'd twisted desperation into evil. Owen showed me videos of Christmas mornings and birthday parties, letting me hear my real parents' voices for the first time I could remember. I watched myself as a toddler, laughing and playing, completely unaware that my future was about to be stolen. Sheriff Amos called at 6 a.m. They'd found the Whitmores at a budget motel 40 miles away. Both were in custody, confused and terrified, unaware their 24-year secret had unraveled. Sheriff Amos asked if I wanted to be there for processing, and every instinct screamed no, but I needed to see them, needed them to know I knew everything. Owen drove me to the station and we watched through one-way glass as they were photographed and fingerprinted, their faces showing the exact moment they realized their lie had died. Sheriff Amos asked if I wanted to speak with them before formal interrogations. I nodded because I needed to hear the truth from their own mouths, needed to understand how 2 people could live with such monstrous lies. She brought Susan Whitmore into an interrogation room, wrists shackled, and Susan saw me and burst into tears. She tried to reach for me despite the chains, saying my name, begging me to understand. I sat across from the woman who'd raised me and asked her to tell me everything, and her confession poured out like poison, finally being purged from an infected wound. Susan confirmed what the journal revealed. She and David had been destroyed by infertility and rejection from adoption agencies. The support group had validated their feelings and slowly normalized increasingly extreme actions. The disbarred investigator proposed taking a child from a loving family and giving that child to people who would love her just as much. Nobody loses, he'd argued, just a different kind of winning. Susan insisted they never intended to hurt anyone. David was only supposed to drug the family and take me while they slept. But my real father had recognized them from somewhere, maybe from the weeks they'd spent in town planning. He'd fought back and David had panicked. I asked how she could justify murdering my parents to steal me. Susan's face crumpled and she said she'd convinced herself I'd be better off with them than in foster care after such trauma. That I'd been so young I wouldn't remember. That giving me a stable, loving home was actually a kindness. She'd rewritten reality in her head until the lies became her truth. Every time I'd called her mom, it had validated her delusion. Every milestone I'd achieved was proof her crime had been a gift. She'd spent 24 years in a fantasy where she was the hero instead of the monster. I told Susan I'd never forgive her for what she'd done to my real family and to me. That she'd stolen my chance to know my actual parents and grow up with my brother. That every memory I had with her was poisoned by the knowledge of how she'd acquired me. She begged me to remember all the good times, all the love she'd given me, as if affection could erase murder. I walked out while she was still talking, and Owen was waiting in the hallway. He asked if I wanted to see David, and I shook my head. I'd heard enough lies to last a lifetime. The FBI arrived within hours. Agent Victoria Cross explained that the support group Susan mentioned had been on their radar for years as part of a suspected illegal adoption network. Susan's journal and cooperation would help them dismantle the entire operation and potentially locate other stolen children. Agent Cross asked if I'd work with them through the investigation, understanding it meant reliving trauma repeatedly. I agreed because other families deserved the truth I'd just discovered, no matter how much it cost me to help find it. The story hit national news within 24 hours. My face was everywhere, split-screened with photos of little Lily Henley from 2 decades ago. Journalists descended on Millbrook like locusts, camping outside Owen's house and the police station. My phone exploded with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, reporters demanding interviews and crying relatives I didn't remember wanting to reconnect. The media called it the Lake House kidnapping and dissected every detail of my stolen childhood for public consumption. Owen took leave from his diner job because customers wouldn't stop asking invasive questions about his murdered parents and missing sister, who'd somehow materialized after 24 years. A defense attorney contacted me through the media asking for a character witness statement for the Whitmores during sentencing. The audacity shocked me into laughter that turned into sobbing I couldn't control. They wanted me to help them avoid consequences for destroying my family and stealing my life. Their lawyer argued they'd raised me well and shown me love, that they deserved consideration for those years of care, as if changing diapers and attending school plays balanced the scales against double murder and kidnapping. Agent Cross returned with updates about the support group investigation. They'd identified 12 members involved in various illegal adoptions. The disbarred investigator had hanged himself rather than face arrest. The fired nurse had overdosed on her own stolen medications. The locksmith was cooperating, providing details about 7 separate kidnappings he'd facilitated over 15 years. Only 3 of those children had been recovered. The others were still missing, their families still searching, their fates unknown. My testimony and willingness to go public had broken the case open and given other victims courage to come forward with suspicions about their own origins. The trial came 6 months later after prosecutors built an overwhelming case. David and Susan both pleaded not guilty despite the journal evidence and DNA confirmation. Their lawyers argued temporary insanity and emotional disturbance, claiming the Whitmores had been victims of manipulation by a predatory support group. Prosecutors countered with evidence of premeditation, lockpick tools, forged documents prepared in advance, sedatives purchased weeks before the murders. Susan's journal showed clear understanding that what they were doing was wrong, destroying any insanity defense. I testified during the victim impact phase, telling the packed courtroom about a normal suburban childhood with good schools and family dinners and birthday parties. Then I described discovering that every moment had been built on my real parents' corpses. I looked directly at David and Susan while speaking, watching their faces crumble as they heard the consequences of their actions from the daughter they'd stolen. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Both received life without parole plus 60 years. They would die in prison. Justice finally served, though it could never bring back what had been taken. Owen and I left through a side exit to avoid the media circus. We drove back to Millbrook in silence, both processing the end of a nightmare that had lasted most of my life. I'd officially changed my name back to Henley through court order, reclaiming the identity I'd been born with. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in recovered kidnapping victims and identity reconstruction. The work was brutal but necessary if I wanted any chance at building a real future. We visited my parents' graves together for the first time, simple granite markers in a small cemetery where Owen had buried them alone at age 10. I placed flowers and apologized for not knowing them, for taking so long to come home, for surviving when they hadn't. Owen said they'd want me to be happy now, to live the life they'd died trying to protect. The best revenge against the Whitmores was building a future they could never touch or taint. I stayed in Millbrook and learned to work the morning shift at Owen's Diner, making coffee and flipping eggs while getting to know the community my real parents had loved. Customers shared stories about my mother tutoring struggling kids for free, and my father doing taxes for low-income families without charge. These stories built a picture of the people I should have known, giving me pieces of the parents the Whitmores had stolen from me. Agent Cross called months after the trial, with news about 2 more children identified through the network investigation, both reunited with biological families. My testimony and willingness to go public had been crucial to breaking the case. Other victims had come forward with suspicions about their own adoptions. I'd helped save families from the same nightmare I'd lived, turning my pain into something that mattered. I found a storage unit David Whitmore had been renting under a false name, filled with Henley family memorabilia stolen during the kidnapping, my real mother's jewelry, photo albums documenting my first 3 years, family videos. Owen cried when I brought it home, seeing pieces of his parents he'd thought were lost forever. We spent weeks going through everything, him telling stories about each photo, rebuilding my history from fragments. The lake house was demolished after forensic teams finished processing it. The town council voted to create a memorial park for victims of violent crime on the property, with a section dedicated to my parents and others harmed by the kidnapping network. Owen designed the memorial, a quiet space with benches and flowers where families could remember their lost loved ones. I stayed away from the dedication ceremony and let Owen represent both of us, unable to face that place again, even transformed into something meant to honor instead of hurt. A year after discovering the truth, I stood in Owen's Diner making coffee for morning regulars and watched sunrise through the front windows. The pain of what the Whitmores had done would never fully heal, but I'd stopped letting it define every moment. I'd found my brother, learned about my real parents, and built connections to a community that had never forgotten me. The Whitmores would die in prison while I lived freely in the town where I'd been born. They'd stolen my childhood, but I'd reclaimed my identity and future, and sometimes that's the only justice victims get. Survival and the knowledge that truth matters more than the lies people tell themselves to justify the unforgivable. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.